It occupies a space on nearly every grocery shelf throughout America. The top is red, the bottom is white. Embedded in the center of the label sits a medallion, placed there following the Paris Exposition of 1900, and it has remained there ever since. The overall design has seen almost no alteration since 1898. Andy Warhol transformed it into high art. Across the nation, Thanksgiving dinners continue to rely on its cream of mushroom for the classic casserole. The Campbell soup might well be the most universally recognized food item in the entirety of American history, but lurking behind that familiar facade is a dynasty largely unknown to most Americans. A chemist who initially earned $7.50 weekly and ultimately passed away in full control of the enterprise. A fortune of such immense scale that two separate states entered into a legal dispute over the right to levy taxes upon it. There was a grandson who filled his luggage, went to Ireland to plant trees, and then entered the American embassy located in Dublin with the purpose of permanently relinquishing his citizenship. Then there is a family, currently spread across 3 different nations, who continue to possess billions of dollars worth of stock, bound by an order never to part with it. This narrative isn't fundamentally about soup, it's a narrative about the profound impact a single innovation can have on an entire bloodline. Chapter 1: The Seventh Chemist. In 1869, a fruit dealer by the name of Joseph Campbell joined forces with Abraham Anderson, a manufacturer of iceboxes, to launch a modest canning venture in Camden, New Jersey. Their output included tomatoes, vegetables, jellies, and minced meat. The business remained small-scale. Anderson departed after only a few years. Campbell continued the work and, following nearly 3 decades, eventually retired in 1894. By this time, a man called Arthur Dorrance had climbed to the company's presidency. Under Arthur's leadership, the operation was consistent and sufficiently profitable. They canned beefsteak tomatoes and distributed them within the region. In 1895, the business introduced its initial ready-to-eat soup. Its sales were reasonably good. Nothing about the enterprise hinted that it was on the verge of becoming a globally dominant food company. That was when Arthur's nephew made his appearance. John Thompson Dorrance was born in Bristol, Pennsylvania on November 11, 1873. He originated from a well-off household. The young Dorrance was intelligent, perpetually active, and deeply fascinated by chemistry. He obtained a Bachelor of Science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1895, after which he traveled to Germany to pursue a doctorate at the University of Göttingen. During his time overseas, he frequented Parisian restaurants, dedicating time to analyzing their soups. He observed a detail that captured his attention. Europeans regarded soup as a fundamental component of their everyday meals. Americans, for the most part, did not share this view. Dorrance was convinced the reason was functional. In America, prepared soups came with a high price, were heavy, and were packaged in overly large cans. If these drawbacks could be addressed, the market presented a vast opportunity. Having finished his doctorate in 1897, Dorrance received academic offers from Columbia, Cornell, Bryn Mawr, and Göttingen itself. He turned down every single one. He opted instead to travel to Camden and request a job at the factory from his uncle. Arthur had his doubts. He viewed his nephew as overly academic, not the type of individual, in his estimation, who would find fulfillment in the business of canning fruits and vegetables for a living. Yet John persisted. He proposed accepting a wage of just $7.50 per week and personally funding his own laboratory setup. His uncle eventually agreed. This proved to be the single most impactful employment choice in the entire history of the American food sector. Dorrance constructed a modest laboratory inside the Camden facility and got to work. His concept was elegantly simple. At the time, canned soup was sold in 32-ounce containers, the bulk of which consisted of water. Each can weighed several pounds and cost a homemaker over 30 cents. The water content made canning expensive, shipping costly, and stocking on shelves pricey. Dorrance's intention was to completely eliminate the water. By reducing soup through cooking into a condensed form, he could maintain the identical flavor and nutritional value within a can roughly 1/3 the size. The consumer could then simply add water at home. The resulting savings in production, transport, and storage were enormous. A soup can that had previously cost over 30 cents could now be sold for just 10. He perfected the formula in 1897. Within a mere 2 years, the very first cans of Campbell's condensed soup appeared on retail shelves. The initial flavor was tomato. It sold instantly. By the early 1900s, the company was offering 21 different soup varieties. Dorrance possessed a scientific mind, but his talents extended beyond the laboratory. He was also attentive to visual presentation. In 1898, a company executive named Herbert Williams went to the annual Cornell vs. Penn football game and came back captivated by the striking red and white of Cornell's new team uniforms. Williams convinced the company to discard its existing black and orange label in favor of adopting that very same color combination. A change born from an autumn afternoon at a football game. It produced a brand identity that has lasted for well over 100 years. 2 years on, Campbell participated in a soup competition held at the 1900 Paris International Exposition. Rather than bringing a chef, the company's representatives simply packed cans of their condensed soup in their luggage. prepared it on site, and were awarded a bronze medal for outstanding product quality. Dorrance had this medal printed onto the label. It has remained there for more than 125 years now. In 1904, a Philadelphia artist named Grace Drayton created illustrations of two rosy-cheeked children for a series of streetcar advertisements. The Campbell kids became a permanent fixture in advertising, outlasting nearly every other campaign from that period. Drayton's drawings provided the brand with a personality that no soup can, regardless of its design, could ever have accomplished by itself. All the while, Dorrance was steadily accumulating power and influence. He was made a director and vice president in 1900, and from that moment forward, he utilized every available dollar to buy up stock from his uncle and his other business partners. Inside the organization, the situation was clearly understood. Dorrance held the knowledge of the recipes. He was the one who had engineered the entire process. If the other shareholders rejected his purchase offers, he could simply walk away, establish a competing business, and ruin them. Whether this threat was ever voiced explicitly remains ambiguous, but the outcome was unmistakable. Share by share, year after year, John Thompson Dorrance was systematically purchasing his way toward complete ownership. When Arthur eventually retired in 1914, his nephew succeeded him as president. The very next year, Dorrance acquired the remaining interests still belonging to the Campbell family, thereby becoming the company's sole proprietor. The individual who had first arrived seeking $7.50 a week now held complete authority over an enterprise that was fundamentally reshaping the American kitchen. At 42 years old, he was merely at the beginning of his journey. Chapter 2: Red, White, and 10 cents. By 1904, the Campbell factory was manufacturing an astounding 16 million cans of soup annually. The operation that had initially canned tomatoes and jellies for a regional customer base was evolving into something far larger. John Dorrance had molded it according to his own vision. He held no interest in preserves. Ketchup was not his concern. His singular focus was selling soup and selling it to the entirety of the nation. He commenced by eliminating any product lines that detracted from this primary goal. The jams, the condiments, the pickled goods were all gradually discontinued. Dorrance held the conviction that a company attempting too many things would excel at none of them. Campbell's purpose would be soup. It would produce it with unparalleled quality, and it would ensure that every household across America recognized the brand. In 1906, Dorrance married Ethel Malincrot in Baltimore. She originated from a prominent family in Maryland. Their union would eventually produce 5 children: 4 daughters, Eleanor, Ethel, Charlotte, and Margaret, and 1 son, John Jeander, who was born in 1919. This marriage positioned Dorrance within the social circles of the East Coast establishment. However, he was not a man suited to a life of relaxation. He was at the factory well before daybreak, concerning himself with every minute aspect of the operation, ranging from the types of tomatoes cultivated on the company's research farms to the precise wording on a streetcar advertisement. By 1911, Campbell Soups had reached California for the very first time, distributing a product prone to spoilage across 3,000 miles of railway and through numerous warehouses represented a considerable logistical accomplishment in the early 20th century. Campbell became a pioneer among food companies in serving the entire nation. Dorrance continued to push forward. In 1912, he started an agricultural program, which placed the company directly in the business of cultivating its own tomatoes. His goal was to maintain control over quality at every stage, beginning with the seed and ending on the store shelf. During the 8 summer weeks of the harvest period, the entire plant was committed to processing tomatoes into soup and juice. No other products were manufactured until the entire tomato crop was fully processed. In 1915, he acquired the Franco-American Food Company, a New Jersey-based producer of canned pasta and soups that had been operating continuously since 1886. Franco-American had originally been the first company in America to commercially manufacture canned soup. Dorrance's motivation for the purchase was not to preserve its existing soup line. Rather, he acquired it to eliminate a rival and take over its distribution infrastructure. The Franco-American brand name was progressively removed from soup products and reassigned to its pasta items. In 1922, the company was reincorporated under an altered name. It had previously been known as the Joseph Campbell Company. Now it was officially the Campbell Soup Company. Placing the word soup directly within the corporate title was a clear statement of intent. This was not a generic canning business. Dorrance wanted no ambiguity whatsoever on that point. By the latter part of the 1920s, Campbell was selling a greater volume of soup than any other company worldwide. During the World War I years, nearly half of the company's total sales were derived from just 2 products: tomato soup and tomato juice. By the time the 1920s concluded, the product range had broadened significantly beyond tomato-based items, yet the fundamental business model remained constant. One core formula, a standardized can, and a price point accessible to nearly everyone. Dorrance held positions on the boards of various banks and railroads, maintained memberships in scientific organizations on both sides of the Atlantic, and had been decorated with the French Legion of Honor. By any standard, he ranked among the wealthiest individuals in the United States, and he was on the verge of making the most costly error of his entire life. Chapter 3: Woodcrest. By 1925, John Thompson Dorrance was generating wealth at a rate exceeding any reasonable capacity for personal expenditure. His company's soup was sold in every state across the Union, and his fortune continued its upward trajectory. He made the decision to acquire a residence that would reflect this status. The property was known as Woodcrest. It was situated on 238 acres in Radnor Township within Philadelphia's Main Line region, encircled by the estates of bankers, railroad magnates, and families whose wealth stretched back generations. The main house itself was a 51-room Elizabethan-style Tudor mansion, reaching 3 stories and constructed from local stone complemented by limestone trim and half-timbered wings. It had been designed around the turn of the century by Horace Trumbauer, Philadelphia's most sought-after residential architect. Trumbauer had previously built mansions for the Widener, Elkins, and Stotesbury families. Woodcrest was his creation for James Paul Jeander, a managing partner at Drexel & Company and the son-in-law of the financier Anthony Drexel. Dorrance paid approximately $1 million for the entire estate, which encompassed both the purchase price and subsequent renovations and furnishings. He had the dark Victorian interior decorations removed, replacing them with lighter finishes more in keeping with the Elizabethan style. On the second floor, there were 10 bedrooms and 5 bathrooms designated for family and guests, in addition to 12 further rooms and 2 baths for the household staff. The third floor provided 5 additional bedrooms, a nursery, and 2 more bathrooms. Elsewhere on the grounds stood a stable, a pool house, a milk house, a cow barn, and a garage capable of holding 7 cars. On November 14, 1925, the Dorrance family moved into their new home. All their personal belongings were transported from their former residence in Cinnaminson, New Jersey. The children were enrolled in local educational institutions. Their social connections, friendships, and daily routines all became centered on Radnor. This was far more than a weekend country escape, it was a permanent relocation. The household was staffed by 16 servants, with an additional 10 to 12 workers responsible for maintaining the grounds. Dorrance entertained often and with great expense. His wife Ethel, who had long anticipated that the family's wealth would finally translate into established social standing, hosted tea parties and garden gatherings that attracted glowing reports in the society columns. When their eldest daughter, Eleanor, made her formal debut into society, one columnist described the event as one of the most beautiful teas of the season. The Dorrances had firmly established themselves on the main line, and their intention was to remain, but not officially. Dorrance possessed an understanding of financial matters that many of his affluent neighbors did not. New Jersey, the location of the Campbell factory and the family's official residence since 1911, taxed inherited wealth at a considerably lower rate compared to Pennsylvania. If Dorrance were to die classified as a Pennsylvania resident, his heirs would be liable for an enormous tax payment to the Commonwealth on a fortune already exceeding $100 million. Consequently, he kept the Cinnaminson property notionally alive. The old house was a simple brick structure with a mansard roof, situated on about 7 acres and surrounded by truck farms. His own wife would later describe it under oath as ordinary and distinctly unattractive. Despite this, Dorrance maintained the pretense that it remained his true home. He kept his voter registration in New Jersey. His driver's license was issued by that state. His banking was done there. His legal advisors practiced there. His will, when he eventually composed it, formally declared him a resident of Cinnaminson Township, Burlington County, and explicitly instructed his executors, under penalty, to file it for probate within that state. This deception was meticulously crafted, but the actual facts painted a contrasting picture. Before the move, Dorrance had employed 10 servants at Cinnaminson. Afterwards, that number fell to 4. Following the deaths of his mother and sister at Cinnaminson in the late 1920s, the staff was reduced to 2. Household expenditure at the New Jersey property dropped from nearly $29,000 annually to roughly $6,500. The combined monthly gas and electric bill at Cinnaminson amounted to approximately $7. Dorrance would visit on occasion. The land adjoined the company's experimental tomato farms, providing practical reasons for his stops. However, none of this altered the essential reality. From November 1925 until his final day, the Dorrance family resided at Woodcrest. Everything else was merely a performance. In the evenings, Dorrance would sit in a house originally built for a member of the Drexel family, overseeing a company that continuously increased his wealth, and he would drink. Multiple sources indicate he drank heavily, a tendency his son would later also develop. He consistently rejected every approach from investment bankers, eager to bring the company to the public stock market. Time magazine would later observe that many a banker had eagerly anticipated the opportunity to bring such an enterprise to market. Yet not one ever succeeded in securing a meeting. Dorrance desired no external ownership, he wanted no external scrutiny. He was willing to keep a $7 electricity bill active for a house he hardly visited, all to protect a fortune that would ultimately outlast him by an entire century. He was 56 years old. He had composed a will running to 35 pages. The elaborate scheme he had so carefully constructed was merely 5 years away from complete failure. and the resulting financial penalty would exceed $30 million. Chapter 4: Death and the Double Tax. John Thompson Dorrance passed away from heart disease on September 21, 1930. He was 56 years old. His death did not occur at Woodcrest. He died at Cinnaminson. The family had spent a portion of that summer at their third residence in Bar Harbor, Maine. Upon their return in the early autumn, Woodcrest was being readied for the coming season. Consequently, Dorrance stopped at the old New Jersey house, the one his wife had characterized as ordinary and distinctly unattractive. It was there, in the place he had spent years pretending was still his home, that his heart finally failed. His executors followed the precise instructions laid out in his will. They submitted the document for probate in Burlington County, New Jersey, formally identifying the deceased as a resident of Cinnaminson Township. His brother Arthur assumed the presidency of the Campbell Soup Company. Dorrance's body was transported across the state line and interred at West Laurel Hill Cemetery in Bala-Cynwyd, Pennsylvania. And then, the official notices started to arrive. Pennsylvania was the first to act. The Commonwealth asserted that Dorrance had been legally domiciled in Radnor Township from the very moment his family moved into Woodcrest in 1925. It appointed an appraiser who valued the estate at just under $200 million and accordingly assessed an inheritance tax amounting to $31,465 lausud. The executors contested this claim. They appealed to the Orphans Court of Delaware County, which initially ruled in their favor and invalidated the assessment. Pennsylvania then escalated the case to the state Supreme Court, and in September of 1932, that court overturned the lower court's decision. It held that Dorrance had indeed been domiciled in Pennsylvania. The supporting evidence was considered overwhelming. The 51-room mansion, the 16 household servants, the children enrolled in local schools, the entirety of his social life conducted from Radnor. His formal declarations, his New Jersey voter registration, his driver's license issued there. None of these carried sufficient weight. A person's actual conduct, the court determined, provides a more reliable indicator than their official paperwork. The executors petitioned the United States Supreme Court to intervene. The court declined to hear the case. They paid Pennsylvania $14,394 lausud, plus accumulated interest, along with a $4 million bond to cover any additional amounts that might subsequently be claimed. Then New Jersey presented its own claim. The state had its own body of evidence. Dorrance had voted there, conducted his banking there, managed his company from Camden, and had explicitly stated in his own will that he was a citizen of New Jersey. The state tax commenced an inheritance tax of $12,247 lausud on an estate valued at over $115 million. The executors argued that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's ruling had already definitively settled the matter. A person cannot be taxed twice for the same event of dying. New Jersey disagreed. Its prerogative court upheld the assessment in 1934. Its Supreme Court affirmed this decision in early 1935. Both courts held that the Pennsylvania ruling was not legally binding on New Jersey. Each individual state possessed the right to determine domicile according to its own criteria, and New Jersey determined that Dorrance rightfully belonged to them. The executors once again appealed to the United States Supreme Court. In December of 1935, Justice Louis Brandeis delivered the court's opinion. The court would not intervene in this matter. The federal judiciary lacked the authority to halt a state tax proceeding that was already progressing through that state's own court system. John Thompson Dorrance, who had devoted the final 5 years of his life to upholding a legal fiction aimed at protecting his fortune, ultimately ended up being legally domiciled in 2 different states at the same time. Pennsylvania collected over $14 million. New Jersey collected over $12 million. The total tax bill came to more than $26 million. Had he simply selected one state and openly declared his residence there, the total amount would likely have been approximately half of that figure. This case became a foundational precedent in American tax law, studied in law school classrooms and cited in courtrooms throughout the remainder of the century. It established the principle that 2 separate states can each claim a deceased individual as a resident, each levy a tax on the same estate, and neither is required to defer to the determination of the other. Nearly 100 years later, estate planning professionals continue to use the Dorrance case as a cautionary tale. He had constructed his entire fortune based on the principle of eliminating the unnecessary. Water from soup, distractions from the product line, partners from the company ownership. Yet in planning for his own death, he introduced an element that was entirely superfluous. A second residence maintained for no genuine purpose other than deception. And it resulted in doubling the eventual tax liability. He left behind a will. The provisions contained within it would bind both the Dorrance family and the Campbell Soup Company throughout the remainder of the 20th century. Chapter 5. The 35-page will. The reading of the will took place in Mount Holly, New Jersey. The assembled heirs learned that John Thompson Dorrance had divided his substantial fortune into 6 separate portions. His widow, Ethel, was allotted 1/4. His only son, John Jingard, known universally as Jack, received 1/4 in addition to his father's personal library and a specific grandfather clock. The 4 daughters, Eleanor, Ethel, Charlotte, and Margaret, each received 1/8 of the total estate. Even a single 1/8 share of the Dorrance estate represented a sum of money that most men could not hope to accumulate in an entire lifetime. At the time the will was formally filed, the total fortune was estimated to be worth approximately $115 million. However, the cash itself was not the primary focus. The stock was what truly mattered. Throughout his life, Dorrance had consistently refused every proposal to sell or dilute his ownership stake in the Campbell Soup Company. In death, his intention was to perpetuate that same refusal. The will contained the strongest possible language instructing his executors not to sell any of the company's shares. If a sale were ever to become absolutely necessary, it was to occur only after what Dorrance termed the greatest deliberation, and furthermore, every single share was to be sold together as one indivisible block. No piecemeal liquidation was permitted, no opportunity for outside investors to acquire a foothold through a series of separate transactions. The structural provisions extended even further. When each of Dorrance's children eventually died, their stock would not simply transfer to their spouses or become merged into other estates. Instead, it would pass directly to their children, his grandchildren. Crucially, Jack's heirs, as a group, were designated to receive double the allotment given to the heirs of each individual daughter. This clause guaranteed that the male line, the branch carrying the Dorrance name forward, would perpetually hold the largest single share of the family's wealth. There existed another strategic calculation underlying his choice of New Jersey residency, one that went beyond simple inheritance tax rate differences. Under Pennsylvania state law, a surviving widow was legally entitled to claim 1/3 of her deceased husband's personal property, irrespective of any provisions stated in his will. New Jersey had no such mandatory spousal protection law. By maintaining the pretense of residing in Cinnaminson, New Jersey, Dorrance ensured that Ethel would receive precisely the amount he had chosen to give her, and not $1 more than that. He had even required her to sign a formal statement prior to his death, affirming that their legal residence was indeed New Jersey. The will was far from being an act of generosity. It was fundamentally an instrument designed for control. It dictated to the family what they were permitted to own, the manner in which they were to own it, and the consequences that would follow any act of disobedience. It created a rigid structure intended to endure for decades, binding children who were still in school and grandchildren who had not yet even been born. Jack Dorrance was just 11 years old at the time. The Philadelphia Record newspaper described him as the nearest thing to a reigning earl or duke that we have in this nation. He had just inherited 1/4 of the largest privately owned food company in all of America, a grandfather clock, and a comprehensive set of instructions that would effectively govern the entire course of his life. Chapter 6: The Prince and the Prisoner. The boy who inherited the soup company matured with a profound awareness of his own identity and position. During his time at Princeton, he drove a car equipped with tear gas jets, a precaution implemented due to fears of kidnapping. Decades later, while serving as chairman of Campbell, he would vary his daily route to the office, constantly accompanied by bodyguards. Jack Dorrance came to Princeton from St. George's School in Newport, Rhode Island, majored in geology, and graduated as a member of the class of 1941. He subsequently enlisted in the Signal Corps, served in China during the war, and rose through the ranks from private to captain. Following the end of the war, he reported for duty on the factory floor in Camden. His father had never intended for him to assume direct operational control of the company. The will granted him ownership, but not the accompanying authority. The older Dorrance had witnessed too many hairs fail when placed in executive positions, and the structural provisions he left behind clearly reflected that concern. Campbell's leadership was first entrusted to Jack's uncle Arthur, and subsequently to a series of executives who were not family members. Jack spent more than a decade gradually working his way through the organizational ranks, serving stints as a floor foreman, an assistant treasurer, and an aide to the president before he was eventually named chairman of the board in 1962. He retained that position for 22 years. During his tenure, Campbell's stock was offered to the public for the first time in 1954, and the company expanded its operations into frozen foods, restaurant ventures, and international markets. However, Jack did not perceive himself primarily as a builder of new enterprises. He viewed his role as that of a guardian, tasked with preserving what his father had originally created. One close friend articulated it simply: Jack felt conscious that his father had made the money, and he had not. He did not find great joy in being rich. He found it as embarrassing as it was fun. Jack married on 2 occasions. His first marriage concluded in divorce in 1963. He subsequently remarried and established a residence in Gladwine within the Main Line region. He had 3 children, a son named John Thompson Dorrance, known since childhood as IP, and 2 younger children, Mary Alice and Bennett. All 3 offspring attended the University of Arizona. Their photographs were notably absent from the university's yearbooks. Jack valued his privacy, and he also drank, perpetuating a pattern established by his father. He shared almost no information with his children regarding the company or the substantial fortune that awaited them. In 1984, he surprised those attending the annual shareholders meeting by announcing, in a single, offhand sentence, that he would be stepping down from his position as chairman. He remained as a member of the board and stayed actively involved at the corporate headquarters. 5 years later, on April 9, 1989, he suffered a fatal heart attack at his home in Bryn Mawr. He was 70 years old. His 3 children transitioned from receiving periodic distributions from trusts to holding direct ownership of approximately 1/3 of the Campbell Soup Company. The fortune that their grandfather had so carefully locked away inside a 35-page will now belong to them. Chapter 7. The Clan Without a Leader. During his final years, Jack Dorrance had made an effort to prepare the succeeding generation for their responsibilities. In March of 1989, he assembled his children, nieces, and nephews at the Greenbrier Hotel in West Virginia for a retreat spanning 3 days, designed to function partly as a family reunion and partly as an educational business seminar. The assembled heirs toured the company's operational facilities, posed questions, and interacted with executives. Jack observed the proceedings from a distance and, for the first time, allowed himself a cautious sense of optimism. He was dead less than 2 weeks after the event concluded. The 9 Dorrance cousins, who now collectively controlled a majority stake in the Campbell Soup Company, were far from being a cohesive family unit. They constituted 3 distinct branches, each harboring its own separate grievances. Jack's children, Mary Alice and Bennett, held the largest combined ownership stake among them. The older cousins, Diana Norris and Hope Van Buren, who were descended from Jack's sister Eleanor, held a smaller yet still significant share. A third group, comprising the descendants of the other 3 Dorrance sisters, fell somewhere in between these 2 factions. Much of the family's aggregate wealth was tied up in Campbell stock that they had inherited entirely free of capital gains tax. However, this stock also represented a kind of trap. Company earnings had remained stagnant for several years under a CEO whose strategy of expansion had generated minimal financial return. Those cousins who desired to sell their shares faced a practical obstacle. If a sufficient number of them attempted to sell their holdings on the open market simultaneously, the stock price would inevitably collapse. The only viable method to extract the full underlying value was to sell the entire company itself. Within just months following Jack's death, a secret plan for a merger had been developed. Its internal code name was Project Toad. The idea originated casually during a ski trip to Vail, when a family member mentioned to a neighbor that Campbell needed to find a new chief executive. The neighbor suggested the head of Quaker Oats as a possible candidate. From that chance conversation, a proposal evolved that would have merged Campbell with Quaker Oats, creating the second largest food company in America, ranking behind only Philip Morris. The merger would also have resulted in relocating the corporate headquarters to Chicago and reducing the Dorrance family's position from majority owners to merely minority shareholders. When Bennett and their cousin George Strawbridge learned about the negotiations that were proceeding without their knowledge or consent, they organized a conference call with the company's chairman and effectively terminated the project. Toad was dead, but the internal rift within the family was not healed. 3 dissident family branches, holding approximately 17% of the company's stock collectively, filed formal documents with the Securities and Exchange Commission, signaling their clear intention to sell their shares. They retained Arthur Limon, the prominent Manhattan lawyer who had interrogated Oliver North during the Iran-Contra hearings, and dispatched him to Campbell's headquarters with a clear message: find a satisfactory solution for everyone involved, or we will force a sale of the company. Jack's 3 children maintained a firm position. They collectively controlled sufficient stock to block any transaction, but preventing a sale was not equivalent to resolving the company's underlying problems. Campbell needed a new strategic direction, and the family required someone from outside the bloodline to provide it. In late 1989, the board recruited David W. Johnson, an Australian-born executive who had previously achieved a successful turnaround at Gerber Products. Johnson restructured operations, closed underperforming business units, and within just 2 years had improved earnings sufficiently to pacify the dissident faction. By January of 1990, the immediate crisis had subsided. The dissident cousins had not fundamentally changed their views, but for the moment the family's center held. Ippy, Mary Alice, and Bennett had done precisely what their grandfathers had mandated of them. They had refused to sell. What none of them could possibly have foreseen was that the eldest of the 3 siblings, the Wyoming rancher who had fought most determinedly to retain the company within the family, would soon make a decision that had no direct connection to Campbell Soup, but everything to do with the massive fortune underlying it. Chapter 8. The Rancher. John Thompson Dorrance III was not raised with the expectation of becoming a businessman. His parents divorced when he was 19, and his mother subsequently took him to Switzerland. He returned to the United States for his college education, enrolled at the University of Arizona, earned a degree in business, and then proceeded to do something no Dorrance before him had ever done. He essentially disappeared from the family sphere. He purchased a ranch situated near Devil's Tower in eastern Wyoming. It encompassed 18,000 acres of open grassland, located far from Camden, far from the main line, far from the weight of the family name. He raised Brangus cattle under the brand IP, a shortened version of his childhood nickname. Epi, as everyone called him, had originated as a young child's attempt to pronounce the Roman numeral after his name, and the nickname simply stuck. For 15 years he lived the life of a rancher. He married a woman named Gundel Sock, and they had 2 sons together. His home was a 3-story chalet filled with mounted game trophies. He was comfortable financially, but not wealthy in any sense that the Dorrance name would typically imply. His father's trust provided a quarterly stipend of $100,000. By any ordinary standard, this was a generous sum, yet it bore absolutely no resemblance to the colossal fortune that remained locked away in Campbell's soup stock, patiently awaiting Jack's death. When his father's heart finally stopped in 1989, everything changed dramatically. Ippy's share of the company was suddenly worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His personal income jumped to $87,000 per day from dividends alone. He joined the Campbell board and surprised everyone with his level of engagement. He proved to be intense, unpredictable, and deeply involved in company affairs. He traveled at his own personal expense to inspect operations in Hong Kong, Spain, and Argentina. One director described it simply: for Ippy, it was a mission. He had fought energetically to keep the company within the family. He had helped to kill Project Toad, and now he found himself confronting a tax code that would, upon his own death, confiscate more than half of everything he had only recently inherited. Chapter 9. The Irish Passport. The underlying mathematics were brutally straightforward. Under American law at that time, when Dorrance eventually died, his estate would owe the federal government 55% of its total value in estate taxes, on a fortune measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars. This meant that his children would lose more than half of their inheritance to the Internal Revenue Service. His grandfather had attempted to manipulate the system by maintaining a fictitious address in New Jersey. That strategy had ultimately cost the family over $26 million. He chose to adopt a completely different approach. He decided to leave the country entirely. In the early 1990s, he invested $1.5 million in planting trees on roughly 1,000 acres of land located in Ireland. Under Irish law at that time, foreign nationals who made qualifying investments within the country were eligible to apply for citizenship. Dorrance satisfied all the requirements. In 1995, he appeared before an Irish judge, swore an oath of fidelity, and officially became a citizen of the Republic of Ireland. Immediately afterwards, he walked into the United States Embassy in Dublin and signed a single-page document formally renouncing his American nationality. The consequences of this action were both immediate and entirely deliberate. In Ireland, the applicable estate tax rate was a mere 2%. Dorrance retained the ability to visit his Wyoming ranch, which he had transferred to his sons 2 years prior. He could still attend Campbell board meetings in Camden, but he was restricted from spending more than 120 days per year on American soil, lest he risk being taxed as a resident once again. In November of 1996, he sold all of his Campbell Soup shares. The transaction was valued at approximately $720 million. He subsequently settled into a Georgian-style townhouse in Dublin, spent his winters at a private estate in Lyford Cay in the Bahamas, and largely disappeared from public view. Official Washington reacted with considerable anger. Representative Patricia Schroeder publicly criticized him from the floor of the House of Representatives. President Clinton proposed the introduction of an exit tax, specifically targeted at wealthy Americans who renounced their citizenship for the purpose of avoiding estate taxes. Dorrance became the most prominent and widely cited example of a new category of American immigrant, not someone fleeing persecution or poverty, but someone fleeing the tax code. The irony inherent in this situation was difficult to overlook. 65 years previously, his grandfather had maintained a house he never actually lived in, all to avoid a state-level inheritance tax. That strategy had backfired spectacularly. Now the grandson had abandoned an entire country for essentially the same underlying reason. The fundamental instinct was identical, only the scale of the action had changed. Chapter 10. The Horsewoman. While Ippy was in the process of preparing to leave the country, his sister was engaged in precisely the opposite course of action. Mary Alice Dorrance Malone remained in Pennsylvania, stayed on the company's board, and remained firmly in the saddle. She was born on February 3, 1950, the middle child of Jack Dorrance and his wife Angeline. She grew up in Chester County, surrounded by its rolling farmland and old money estates, and joined the Brittle Wild Pony Club in Gladwine as a young girl. The connection she formed with horses during those early years never diminished over time. By her 20s, she was operating a boarding and training facility in Arizona, coaching young riders, and founding both the Tucson Dressage Club and the Saguaro Pony Club. In 1976, she returned to Pennsylvania and established Iron Spring Farm in Coatesville. European warmbloods were still largely unfamiliar in the United States at that time, and American breeders had very limited access to the bloodlines that dominated international dressage competition. Mary Alice set about changing that situation. She began importing Dutch warm-blood stallions from the Netherlands, and over the subsequent 4 decades, she introduced some of the most influential sport horse sires in the entire world to American soil. Roar, a stallion who excelled in both Grand Prix jumping and dressage, became one of the most celebrated and recognized stallions in the country. She later established the RAR Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting dressage education throughout the United States. Winston Sebastian Consul and Contango followed in subsequent years. Contango alone amassed 33 Grand Prix victories and multiple national championships. Mary Alice was far more than simply a breeder who observed from the sidelines. She actively competed with a stallion named Rample. She earned a place on the United States Olympic short list and played a role in demonstrating that American-bred horses could perform at the highest international competitive levels. Over the course of her career, she accumulated more than 87 victories at the Grand Prix level, earned her bronze, silver, and gold medals from the United States Dressage Federation, and claimed top honors at both the Royal Dressage Festival and the USC Festival of Champions. She was among the very first to import approved Friesian stallions specifically for high-performance dressage, at a time when that breed was rarely seen in international competition. In early 2025, the Royal Warmblood Studbook of the Netherlands honored her with a Lifetime Achievement Award recognizing her contributions. Iron Spring Farm eventually expanded to include a winter training facility located in Wellington, Florida. The horses she bred and imported went on to compete at the Olympic Games, the Paralympic Games, and the FEI World Cup Dressage Final. Their offspring won medals at World Driving Championships and performed at prestigious venues such as Aachen, Hickstead, and Spruce Meadows. What had begun as a single farm in Coatesville evolved into one of the most respected equestrian breeding programs anywhere in the world. But horses represented only one half of her life's focus. The other half remained firmly connected to Camden. Mary Alice was elected to the Campbell Board of Directors in 1990, exactly 1 year after her father's death. Her tenure as a director was longer than that of any other individual in the company's entire history. Her personal 18% ownership stake made her the single largest individual shareholder, and Forbes magazine estimated her personal fortune at $4.1 billion. She served on both the governance and compensation committees, attending meetings with the quiet, consistent dedication of someone who understood that her presence was not merely ceremonial, it was structurally essential. As long as Mary Alice Malone continued to hold both her shares and her board seat, the Dorrance family retained its firm grip on the company's direction. She was intensely protective of her privacy. She granted almost no interviews and made no public statements whatsoever concerning the family conflicts that had occurred during the late 1980s. When a former cook and traveling companion named Agnes O'Brien attempted to extort money from her in 2009, threatening to publish a tell-all book about her personal life unless she paid $1 million, Mary Alice responded by going directly to law enforcement authorities. The FBI conducted an investigation. O'Brien was arrested in August of 2010, formally charged with extortion, and pleaded guilty the following May. Mary Alice made no public comment about the matter whatsoever. She never spoke about the case in public, never issued any official statement, and never acknowledged the episode in any public forum. The silence was both deliberate and absolute. She had 2 daughters, Mary Alice Malone Jr. and Catherine Dorrance Malone. She raised them in the same Chester County countryside where she herself had grown up. Among the same hills and horse farms that had shaped her own childhood, Mary Alice Dorrance Malone died peacefully at her home on June 16, 2025. She was 75 years old. The Campbell's company issued a statement describing her as a highly committed director, whose knowledge of the company's history and culture was invaluable. Within just weeks of her death, her eldest daughter was appointed to fill her vacant seat on the board. The transition occurred seamlessly. The seat passed in the same manner that a title passes within an old European noble house. Not because it was inherently owed, but because someone had to hold it. The money was inherited. The horses were a matter of personal choice. Chapter 11. The default leader. Bennett Dorrance was the youngest of Jack's 3 children, and in many respects, the least publicly visible. He did not breed Olympic-caliber horses. He did not renounce his citizenship. He relocated to Arizona following his college graduation and remained there, constructing a life that bore little resemblance to what the Dorrance name would typically suggest. In the early 1980s, he co-founded DMB Associates, a real estate development firm headquartered in Scottsdale. The company built master-planned residential communities and commercial properties across Arizona, California, and Utah. It was successful and respected within its industry, and it was entirely unrelated to the soup business. Bennett had no personal ambition to run Campbell, but he understood more clearly than most of his relatives that someone within the family had to assume the responsibility of maintaining the coalition's unity. He joined the Campbell board in 1989, the same year his father died. He was in his early 30s at the time. The company was in a state of crisis. Cousins were actively threatening to sell their shares. A secret merger proposal with Quaker Oats had only just been terminated. The family voting trust was in the process of dissolving. Bennett stepped directly into this chaotic situation, not as a dealmaker or a corporate strategist, but in the role of a mediator. He held a 15% ownership stake in the company, and he deployed it in the manner a diplomat uses leverage quietly, consistently, and without drawing any undue attention to himself. At a family business conference held in the mid-1990s, Bennett described his role within the family in terms that no one in the audience would have envied. He referred to himself as the default leader of the Dorrance family. No one else was either willing or able to do it, he explained, and no one else was interested in trying. The title was not intended to be flattering. It was simply accurate. Eppie had departed from the country. Mary Alice was primarily focused on her horses and her board responsibilities. The cousins from the other branches of the family were geographically scattered, some disengaged from family matters entirely, and some actively hostile. Bennett was the one who made the necessary phone calls, arranged the meetings, and worked consistently to ensure that the 33% family ownership stake continued to vote as a unified bloc, rather than fragmenting into a dozen competing individual interests. He resided in Paradise Valley, an affluent community nestled against Camelback Mountain on the eastern edge of Phoenix. His life there was comfortable but deliberately kept at a low profile. He avoided contact with the press. He did not appear on magazine covers or celebrity wealth lists with the same frequency as his siblings did. When Forbes estimated his net worth at roughly $3.3 billion, he offered no comment on the figure. His work on the Campbell board was similarly understated in its public profile. He served for more than 3 decades from 1989 to 2022, attending meetings in Camden with the regularity of a man who treated the obligation as simply non-negotiable. He did not deliver speeches about the company's strategic direction. He did not publicly challenge management decisions or stage confrontations in the boardroom. He voted, he consulted with others, and he ensured that the Dorrance family's collective interests were represented at every critical juncture. When activist investors pressured the company to consider strategic alternatives, Bennett was part of the family voting bloc that held the line and resisted. In 2022, he stepped down from the board and formally handed his seat to his son, Bennett Dorrance Jeter. This transition mirrored what Mary Alice would do 3 years later, passing her own board seat to her daughter. A discernible pattern was beginning to form. The third generation was gradually yielding to the fourth, and the mechanism remained the same in each instance. A board seat was transferred directly from parent to child, carrying with it the unspoken but clear expectation that the new director would protect and preserve what the family had so carefully built. Bennett's contribution to the dynasty was not dramatic in nature. There were no 87 Grand Prix victories associated with his name, no Georgian townhouse in Dublin, no front-page congressional hearings. What he provided instead was continuity. For more than 30 years, he occupied the space between those family members who wanted to sell and those who wanted to hold on to the company, between the cousins who had lost interest entirely and the siblings who perhaps cared too much. And through his efforts, he kept the entire structure from collapsing. It was the kind of essential work that no one ever notices until it suddenly stops being done. The Dorrance fortune required someone like Bennett. Not a visionary, not a rebel, not a horseman. A manager, someone willing to fly to Camden 4 times annually, sit in a conference room, review the financial numbers, and then fly home again. Someone willing to pick up the telephone when a cousin in Connecticut expressed a desire to liquidate her shares, and talk her out of doing so. Someone willing to be the default leader, because the only alternative was having no leader at all. By the time he eventually handed his seat over to his son, the family still controlled roughly 1/3 of the company. This was less than the 59% they had held when Jack died, but it was still enough. Enough to block a hostile takeover attempt, enough to exert influence on the board, enough to ensure that the Dorrance name still carried significant weight in Camden. That particular outcome was not inevitable by any means. It was the result of decades of unglamorous, largely invisible work, and most of that work had been carried out by the youngest of Jack's 3 children, sitting in a house in Paradise Valley, making phone calls that no one outside the immediate family would ever hear about. Chapter 12. During the summer of 1962, a 33-year-old commercial illustrator named Andy Warhol presented an exhibition of 32 small canvases at the Ferris Gallery in Los Angeles. Each individual painting depicted a single can of Campbell's condensed soup, one for every variety that the company then manufactured. Tomato, chicken noodle, cream of celery, pepper pot. They were arranged for display on a narrow wooden shelf that extended the full length of the gallery wall, positioned like products on a supermarket aisle. The art world was uncertain how to interpret them. A gallery located directly across the street placed actual Campbell soup cans in its own window and offered them for sale at 60 cents each, mocking the very notion that a soup can could legitimately belong in an art exhibition. Critical responses dismissed the show as superficial, a mere publicity stunt, a joke at the expense of anyone who might take it seriously. Sales of the works were poor. The gallery's co-owner Irving Blum ultimately made the personal decision to retain the entire set of paintings for himself. He paid a total of $4,000 for all 32 works. 34 years later he sold them to the Museum of Modern Art in New York for $15 million. Warhol had not selected Campbell's as his subject arbitrarily. He mentioned that he had eaten the same lunch every single day for 20 years. The familiar red and white can was the most commonplace object in his kitchen, and that very familiarity was precisely the point. By depicting it with the precise, impersonal technique of a commercial draftsman, and then exhibiting it within a fine art gallery, he forced viewers to confront a question that had no comfortable answer. Where does commerce end and culture actually begin? Is a soup can transformed into art simply by being placed on a shelf within a gallery? Does it cease to be a commercial product when it hangs on a wall inside a museum? These questions were not merely rhetorical. They fundamentally altered the trajectory of American art. Before Warhol's emergence, the dominant movement in American art was abstract expressionism. Painters such as Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning, who celebrated the unique individual gesture, the visible evidence of the brushstroke, the artist as a tortured creative genius. Warhol rejected this entire tradition. He traced projected photographic images onto canvas with the mechanical precision characteristic of advertising layout work. He deliberately smoothed away every visible trace of his own hand in the painting process. The Soupcan paintings appeared almost machine-printed. This effect was entirely intentional. If mass production had come to define American life, then art should arguably reflect the aesthetic of mass production as well. What Warhol almost certainly did not know was the specific history behind the label he was depicting. The red and white color scheme had been chosen in 1898 by a Campbell executive named Herbert Williams, who had attended a college football game at Cornell University and admired the team's colors displayed there. The gold medallion prominently stamped into the center of the label commemorated a bronze medal the company had actually won at the 1900 Paris Exposition. Both of these historical details were already more than 60 years old by the time Warhol set up his easel. The label itself had scarcely changed throughout all those years. It was already a recognized artifact of American commercial history before it ever became an artifact of American art. The irony of the situation only deepened over the subsequent decades. In 1962, Warhol was still struggling to achieve recognition, desperate to break free from the commercial illustration work that paid his bills but earned him no respect from the established art world. Campbell, by way of contrast, stood as one of the most successful corporations in America. Its cans were stacked on shelves in virtually every grocery store across the country. By the end of the century, the balance of cultural value had shifted dramatically. Warhol's paintings of soup cans were worth more per square inch than anything the Campbell Soup Company itself had ever manufactured. The artistic representation had become more valuable than the original commercial product. When visitors now go to Warhol's gravesite in Bethel Park, Pennsylvania, they do not typically leave flowers. They leave actual cans of Campbell's soup. Tomato soup, mostly. The cans accumulate on the headstone, rain-spotted and sun-faded, placed there by strangers who intuitively understand that the gesture carries meaning, even if they cannot precisely articulate what that meaning is. It is simultaneously tribute, joke, and cultural commentary all blended together. Warhol would likely have appreciated this ambiguity. He spent his entire artistic career deliberately blurring the line between sincerity and irony. And in death, the blurring continues. The red and white label that a company executive casually copied from a college football uniform more than a century ago now hangs in the most prestigious modern art museum in the entire world. The Paris Exposition medallion is still present on the can. The design is still present on the store shelf. And somewhere in the ambiguous space between the grocery store easel and the gallery wall, a 10-cent can of condensed soup has become the single most recognized image in all of American pop art. And the Dorrances never commissioned these paintings. They never requested them. They never needed to. The can spoke entirely for itself. After $15 billion of soup, in November of 2024 the company officially changed its name. It was no longer to be known as the Campbell Soup Company. It was now simply the Campbell's Company. The removal of the apostrophe in the word soup were relatively minor adjustments, but they accurately reflected a business that had expanded far beyond the single product that had originally built it. The company that John Thompson Dorrance had so carefully shaped around a single can of condensed soup now generated $9.6 billion in annual revenue and owned a portfolio of brands that included Pepperidge Farm, Goldfish, V8 Swanson Pace and Prego. It remained headquartered in Camden, New Jersey, in the very same city where a 24-year-old chemist had once set up a modest laboratory and offered to work for $7.50 per week. The growth had occurred in distinct waves over time. Pepperidge Farm was acquired in 1961. Pace Foods followed later. In 2018, Campbell paid $6.1 billion to acquire Snyder's-Lance, the manufacturer of Cape Cod chips and Kettle brand potato chips. In 2024, it added Sovos brands for $2.9 billion, thereby bringing Rao's pasta sauce into the corporate portfolio. Each successive acquisition pushed the company further away from its soup-focused origins and closer to the operational model of a diversified packaged food conglomerate. The iconic red and white can was still present on store shelves, but it was no longer the absolute center of the business. The Dorrance family no longer held a majority of the company's outstanding shares. Decades of estate settlements, gradual stock sales, and generational wealth dilution had reduced the combined family ownership stake to roughly 33%. This was a significant reduction from the 59% they had controlled at the time of Jack's death in 1989. However, through strategically maintained board positions and coordinated voting agreements, the descendants of the original inventor still exercised more influence over the company than any other single shareholder group. Bennett Dorrance Jr. held a seat on the board. Mary Alice Malone Jeter had joined following her mother's death. Eppie remained in Dublin, now a billionaire several times over, no longer a shareholder in the company, but still connected to the dynasty by virtue of his name and lineage. There were now approximately 87 living descendants of John Thompson Dorrance. They were geographically scattered across 3 different countries. Some among them had never even met one another. A few had never visited the corporate headquarters in Camden. The family that had once gathered together at the Greenbrier, all wearing matching red and white bandanas, now communicated, when they communicated at all, through lawyers and trust officers. And yet, the fundamental instruction that their patriarch had inscribed into a 35-page will nearly a century earlier still echoed through every boardroom vote and every quarterly earnings call. Do not sell. Do not lose control. Pass the fortune forward to the next generation. 3 successive generations had obeyed this instruction, each in their own distinctive way. The grandfather had built the company and refused every offer to take it public. His son Jack had served as chairman for 22 years and never diversified the family's concentrated holdings. Jack's 3 children had subsequently split into 3 different personal directions, one to Ireland, one to the horse farms of Pennsylvania, one to the desert of Arizona. But all 3 had either retained their shares or ensured that their board seats passed cleanly to the next generation. The 4th generation was now in place and actively involved. Bennett Jr. in Scottsdale, Mary Alice Jr. in Chester County, and Ippie's sons in Europe. They had inherited not merely money, but also an obligation that none of them had personally chosen and that none of them could easily refuse or escape. The will did not merely distribute assets, it imposed a purpose, and the cumulative weight of that purpose, the persistent expectation that each successive generation would sacrifice something of its own preferences to keep the company intact, had shaped virtually every major decision the family had made since 1930. The can remains red on top, white on the bottom. The medallion from the Paris Exposition is still pressed into the label. 128 years after a young chemist figured out how to remove the water from a pot of soup, his fundamental invention still occupies space on shelves and in kitchens across America. It costs considerably more than 10 cents now. But the design is almost entirely unchanged. The script is still cursive, the gold medal is still there. The unresolved question that the Dorrances have never been able to definitively answer is whether the family itself can hold together for as long as the soup can has already done. 3 generations have now made the attempt. A 4th generation is currently in position. The fortune stands at approximately $15 billion. The will says hold, the underlying instinct, as 2 different men named John Thompson Dorrance demonstrated in 2 different centuries, says protected at whatever cost may be required. Whether these 2 fundamental impulses can continue to coexist for yet another generation remains the only question that truly matters.